Part 1, the ride I never agreed to take. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the nursing home. It wasn't the suitcase in the trunk. It wasn't even the stack of admission papers waiting on the receptionist's desk. The first sign was my son's silence. Daniel had always talked when he was nervous. As a boy, he'd chatter nonstop before a baseball game. As a teenager, he'd ramble when he was hiding a bad report card. Even as a grown man, he filled uncomfortable moments with words. That morning, he barely spoke at all. And somehow, that scared me more than anything. I was 72 years old when my son drove me to a nursing home without telling me. But the truth is, I lost him long before we ever pulled into that parking lot. I just didn't know it yet. The Texas sun was already bright when Daniel picked me up that morning. I remember standing on the front porch of my home, adjusting the sleeve of my cream-colored sweater. The same house Richard and I had lived in for 46 years. The same porch where we'd watched Daniel ride his first bicycle. The same porch where my husband kissed me goodbye every morning before work. The same porch where I stood alone now, waiting. Daniel pulled into the driveway in his black SUV. He got out, smiled, but it wasn't really a smile. It was something people wear when they're trying to look normal. "Morning, Mom. Morning, sweetheart." I leaned in and kissed his cheek. He smelled like the same cologne he'd worn for years. For a moment, he was 10 years old again. For a moment, he was still my little boy. "You hungry?" he asked, always. That finally earned a real smile. Small, brief, gone almost immediately, I should have noticed. Instead, I grabbed my purse and climbed into the passenger seat. I thought we were going to breakfast. That had been our tradition for years, just the two of us. Coffee, pancakes, conversation. A mother and son pretending time moved slower than it actually did. The drive started normally. Traffic, radio, small talk. But after 10 minutes, I realized something strange. We weren't heading toward the diner. We weren't even heading toward downtown. We were driving east. Away from everything familiar, I glanced out the window. Did they move the restaurant? Daniel laughed too quickly. No, then silence again. The kind of silence that sits between people like an unwanted guest. I watched him grip the steering wheel. His knuckles were white, my stomach tightened. "Daniel, yeah, is everything okay?" "Of course." Too fast, too rehearsed. The answer arrived before the question had even finished. Outside, the city faded into quieter streets, then neighborhoods, then open roads. I felt a strange chill despite the warm morning. "Where are we going?" Daniel stared straight ahead. "Just trust me, those two words." Funny how dangerous they become when someone refuses to explain them. I turned toward the passenger window, trying not to overthink. Trying not to become one of those older women who sees problems everywhere. But something inside me wouldn't settle, a mother's instinct. The same instinct that wakes you up at 2 in the morning because your child has a fever before you even hear them cry. The same instinct that tells you when someone's heart is breaking behind a smile. 20 minutes later, we turned into a long driveway, beautiful landscaping, fresh flowers, a stone fountain. The building looked more like a luxury hotel than a medical facility. Then I saw the sign. Willow Grove Senior Living. My breath caught. For a second, I thought there had been a mistake. Maybe we were picking someone up. Maybe Daniel had a meeting. Maybe then I saw Sophie, standing near the entrance, waiting. My daughter-in-law wore a pale blue blouse and carried a leather folder against her chest. She looked prepared, too prepared. The moment our eyes met, something inside me dropped. Not fear, recognition. The kind that arrives when a puzzle piece finally slides into place. Daniel parked. The engine stopped. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence inside the SUV felt enormous. I turned toward him, slowly. "What is this?" He stared at the steering wheel, not me, the steering wheel. As though it could answer for him. Daniel, still nothing. Outside, Sophie started walking toward the vehicle. My pulse quickened. "What is this?" His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mom," that was all, just one word. But I heard everything hidden inside it. Guilt, shame, fear, I looked past him, toward the rearview mirror, toward the back of the SUV. And that's when I saw it, a suitcase, my suitcase. The navy blue one from my bedroom closet, the one I hadn't packed, the one I hadn't touched. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world seemed to narrow into a single terrible realization. Someone had packed my things, someone had planned this. Someone had made decisions about my life without me. The passenger door opened. Sophie stood outside, smiling softly. The same smile that had charmed our family 18 years ago. The same smile I once trusted. "Good morning, Mom." I looked at her, then at Daniel, then back at her. "What is my suitcase doing here?" Neither answered, and suddenly I understood, not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to know this wasn't a surprise. Enough to know they had discussed it, planned it, agreed on it without me. Sophie gently placed a hand on the open door. "We just think you'll be happier here." I stared at her, then at my son, waiting, begging for him to say she was wrong. For him to tell me this was some misunderstanding. For him to be my son. Instead, Daniel lowered his eyes and said the words that shattered something inside me. "I think it's best for everyone. Everyone, not you, Mom, not for your health, not for your happiness, for everyone." And in that moment, I realized something I would spend the rest of the story trying to understand. I was no longer included in that word, everyone. A few minutes later, a receptionist greeted us inside. Part 2, the daughter I thought I had. The strangest thing about betrayal is that it never starts looking like betrayal. If it did, nobody would let it through the front door. It arrives wearing kindness, good manners, warm smiles, homemade desserts. And sometimes, it arrives looking exactly like the daughter you've always wanted. Sitting in that nursing home lobby, staring at the admission papers my son had already signed. I found myself thinking about the first day I met Sophie, not because I wanted to. Because grief has a cruel habit of dragging you back to the beginning. Back to the moment you missed the warning signs. Back to the moment you opened the door. 18 years earlier, Daniel had called me on a Thursday afternoon. "Mom." I could hear excitement in his voice. The kind I hadn't heard since college. "I want you to meet someone." Richard looked over the top of his newspaper when I hung up. "Serious?" I smiled. "I think so." Richard nodded. "Then this might be the one." At the time, neither of us knew how right he was, or how wrong. Sophie arrived at our house the following Sunday. I still remember exactly what she looked like. Navy blue dress, simple pearl earrings, a nervous smile. She carried a small box of homemade lemon bars, not store-bought, homemade, that mattered to me. When I opened the front door, she immediately held out the box. "Mrs. Whitmore, I heard these are your favorite." I blinked. Most girlfriends showed up with flowers. She'd somehow learned my favorite dessert. Richard laughed from behind me. "Daniel," he shook his head. "You didn't tell us she was smart." Everyone laughed, including Sophie, especially Sophie. She had a way of making people feel comfortable almost immediately. Like she'd known them longer than she had. That dinner went beautifully, too beautifully. At least now, looking back, it feels that way. Sophie asked questions. Not the polite questions people ask because they're expected to, real questions. She wanted to know how Richard started the company. How Daniel behaved as a child, how we met. How we survived the years when money was tight. By dessert, Richard adored her. By coffee, I did too. On the drive home, Daniel called. "So?" I laughed. "You know exactly what we're going to say." His relief was immediate and genuine. For a long time, I believed his love for Sophie was one of the best decisions he ever made. Maybe part of me still does. Because life is rarely simple enough to divide people into heroes and villains. The next few years passed quickly. Engagement, wedding, the first house, the first promotions, the first holidays together. And Sophie became part of our family so naturally that I stopped thinking of her as my son's wife. She was just Sophie. One Thanksgiving, I walked into the kitchen and found her standing over a turkey, looking completely panicked. I couldn't help smiling. "Need help?" She sighed dramatically. "Oh, thank God." We spent 3 hours cooking together, laughing, talking, making gravy, burning rolls, fixing mistakes. At one point she looked at me and said, "I hope one day I can do this as well as you." I remember putting my hand over hers. "You don't have to do it like me." She smiled, "I know." Then she added, "But I'd still like to learn." That moment stayed with me for years. Because I'd never had a daughter. And for a little while, it felt like life had decided to give me one anyway. When Lily was born, things only became closer. I was there at the hospital. I held my granddaughter before anyone else besides her parents. Sophie cried when she placed Lily in my arms. "You already love her, don't you?" I laughed through tears. "Of course." Sophie smiled. "No," she shook her head, "you really love her." At the time, it felt like gratitude. Now I wonder if it was also observation. Because Sophie noticed everything. More than most people realized. Years passed, birthdays, Christmases, soccer games, family vacations. Memories piled on top of memories. And if you'd asked me then whether I trusted Sophie, I would have said yes without hesitation. Completely, absolutely, like family, especially family. The first crack appeared so quietly I almost missed it. It happened during Lily's 7th birthday party. The house was full, children running everywhere, cake, balloons, noise. The beautiful chaos of family life. At one point, Lily came running toward me. "Grandma." She threw her arms around my waist. I hugged her back. The kind of hug that makes your entire day better. Then Sophie appeared beside us, smiling. But something about the smile felt different, only for a second. A tiny moment, easy to ignore. Lily looked up at me. "Grandma helped me make the cookies," I laughed. "They were mostly your cookies." Before Lily could answer, Sophie spoke. "Actually," her tone remained light, cheerful, almost playful. "It was my recipe." Silence. Just for a second, not enough for anyone else to notice. But I did because it was unnecessary. Nobody was competing, nobody was keeping score. At least I wasn't. I smiled anyway. "Then they were your cookies." Sophie smiled back. The moment passed, or so I thought. But later that night, Richard and I sat on the back porch watching the sunset. He sipped his iced tea, quiet, thoughtful. The way he always became when something bothered him. Finally I asked, "What?" He stared into the yard, then toward the house. Toward the window, where Daniel and Sophie stood talking. And for the first time in years, I heard concern in his voice. "Do you ever get the feeling Sophie wants to be the center of every room she's in?" I frowned. "She's confident." "Maybe." Richard nodded slowly. Then looked at me. "Or maybe she hates sharing the room." A chill moved through me, tiny, brief, gone almost immediately. I laughed it off. Defended her, explained it away. Because that's what people do when they love someone. They protect the version of that person they want to believe in. Richard didn't argue, he just nodded. But before we went inside, he said something that would haunt me years later. Something I didn't understand at the time. Something I desperately wish I had. "Sophie doesn't worry me, Ellie." I looked at him. "Then what does?" Richard's eyes stayed fixed on the house, on our son. On the family we'd spent decades building. And quietly, almost sadly, he answered, "How much Daniel needs people to approve of him." And for the first time, I saw fear in my husband's eyes. Part 3. When money entered the room. The moment money enters a family, people don't suddenly become different. That's the lie we tell ourselves. The truth is much harder. Money doesn't change people, it reveals them. Looking back now, I don't think Sophie became ambitious when Richard got sick. I think Richard's illness simply removed the last reason for her to hide it. The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was organizing old photographs in the study when Richard walked through the front door. Something felt wrong immediately, not because of what he said, because of how quiet he was. My husband had spent 40 years solving problems. When something broke, he fixed it. When something failed, he rebuilt it. Silence wasn't natural for him. He loosened his tie, set his keys on the table. Then sat down without speaking. I remember lowering the photograph in my hand. "Richard." He looked up, his smile appeared, briefly, painfully. The smile people wear when they don't know how to protect someone from the truth. And suddenly I knew, not what. Just that something had changed, forever. The diagnosis arrived 3 days later. Cancer, aggressive, advanced. I don't remember much after that. Only fragments, doctors' offices, medical terminology, insurance discussions, treatment plans, hope, fear, denial. The strange way ordinary life continues even when your world is collapsing. Richard handled it better than I did, at least on the surface. He still went to work, still attended meetings, still made people laugh. But something inside him had shifted. For the first time in our marriage, he began preparing for a future he might not be part of. And that's when the family meetings started. At first they made sense. Daniel wanted updates. Sophie wanted to help. Everyone was concerned. Everyone was supportive, or so I believed. The first meeting took place in our dining room. The same room where we'd celebrated birthdays, graduations, anniversaries. Now legal folders covered the table. Investment reports, business records, insurance policies. Richard sat at the head of the table, Daniel beside him, me across from them. And Sophie quietly taking notes. At first she barely spoke, just listened, observed. Asked the occasional question, reasonable questions, smart questions. The kind nobody would object to. But by the third meeting, something had changed. I noticed it before anyone else. Because mothers spend their lives noticing things nobody says out loud. Sophie wasn't asking questions anymore. She was steering conversations, subtly, carefully, skillfully. Like someone moving pieces on a chessboard one square at a time. One evening, Richard mentioned a trust account. Immediately Sophie leaned forward. Who manages that? Richard answered. Eleanor. Sophie smiled, of course. A perfectly pleasant response, except for what followed. Wouldn't it make sense for Daniel to learn those responsibilities too? The room fell quiet, not awkward, just thoughtful. The suggestion sounded reasonable. That was the danger. The most effective manipulation rarely sounds unreasonable. Richard looked at me, then at Daniel, then back at Sophie. We'll discuss it later. The conversation moved on, but Sophie didn't, not really. Over the following months, similar comments appeared everywhere, like seeds being planted, one by one, patiently, strategically. Daniel should be more involved. Daniel deserves to understand the family finances. Daniel needs experience making decisions. None of those statements were wrong. That was what made them effective. The problem wasn't what she said. The problem was where the conversations always ended. With Daniel gaining influence, and me quietly losing it. One night after dinner, I walked past the library and heard voices inside. Daniel's voice, Sophie's voice. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But my name stopped me. Your mother controls everything. Silence, then Daniel, takes care of everything. A pause, a correction, a defense. I smiled, relieved, then Sophie answered. And something inside me went cold. That's exactly my point. The room beyond the doorway went quiet. I stood perfectly still, not moving, not breathing, not wanting to hear more, unable to leave. Sophie's voice remained calm, measured, not angry, almost thoughtful. If your mother controls everything, we'll wait forever. The sentence hit harder than it should have. Because it wasn't about money, not really. It was about patience, about expectation, about entitlement. Daniel didn't respond immediately, and somehow that hurt more. Finally he said, she's just trying to protect the family. Sophie laughed softly. The kind of laugh people use when they think someone is being naive. Or maybe she's trying to protect her place in it. I stepped away from the door, quietly, before I heard the rest. Before I heard Daniel's answer. Because for the first time in years, I didn't want to know. That night, Richard found me sitting alone on the back porch. The Texas sky stretched endlessly above us. Stars, silence, summer air. He sat beside me, no questions, just presence. After 46 years of marriage, sometimes that was enough. Eventually he spoke. You heard them. It wasn't a question, I nodded. Richard stared into the darkness. For a long moment neither of us said anything. Then he sighed, a tired sound, a worried sound. A sound I rarely heard from him. I've been expecting this. I turned toward him. What do you mean? He looked older than I remembered, not physically, emotionally. Like the diagnosis had forced him to see things he'd been avoiding. People think families fall apart because of greed. He shook his head. Most of the time that's not true. I frowned. Then why do they fall apart? Richard's eyes drifted toward the house. Toward the lights glowing inside, toward our son, toward the future. And when he finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. They fall apart when someone starts believing they deserve what hasn't been given yet. The words settled heavily between us. I didn't realize it then. But that was the night Richard stopped worrying about the company. Stopped worrying about the money. Stopped worrying about the trust. Because he'd started worrying about something far more fragile, our family. And as I looked through the window into the house, I saw Daniel and Sophie standing together in the kitchen, talking quietly, planning something. I couldn't hear the words, but for the first time in my life, I found myself wondering a question no mother ever wants to ask. Was my son still protecting me? Or had he already started protecting something else? Part 4, my son started disappearing. The cruelest losses don't happen all at once. Nobody wakes up one morning and discovers they've lost their child. It happens slowly, quietly, one missed phone call, one canceled lunch. One conversation that never happens. Until one day, you realize you're mourning someone who's still alive. Looking back now, I can't tell you the exact day I started losing Daniel. I only know the signs appeared long before I was willing to admit it. The first sign was Saturday morning. For nearly 20 years, Daniel and I had a tradition: coffee every Saturday. No matter how busy life became. No matter how demanding work was, no matter what happened. Saturday mornings belonged to us. When he was younger, we'd meet at a small diner near the lake. Later, after success found him, we upgraded to expensive coffee shops. The location changed, the tradition didn't. Then one Saturday, Daniel canceled. Nothing unusual, work emergency, I understood. The next week he canceled again, then again and again. Eventually, the invitations stopped altogether. At first I told myself he was busy. Because that's what mothers do. We explain away our own heartbreak. We build excuses for the people we love, anything to avoid the truth. One afternoon I called him, just to hear his voice. The call went to voicemail. I left a message, nothing urgent, just, "Hi, sweetheart. Call me when you get a chance." 3 days passed, then 4, then 5. When he finally called back, his voice sounded distracted, rushed. Like a man checking something off a list. "Sorry, Mom, no problem, things have been crazy." I smiled even though he couldn't see it. I understand. And I did, at least I thought I did. Until I saw a social media post 2 days later. Daniel and Sophie, at brunch, on a Saturday morning, my Saturday morning. The same hours we'd spent together for nearly 2 decades. I stared at the photo longer than I should have. Not because they looked happy. Because nobody had thought to tell me. The next changes came inside the company. Richard still held the title, but his health was declining. That meant more responsibility falling to Daniel. Which should have made me proud, and it did, at first. Then I noticed something strange. Decisions were being made without me. Small decisions, harmless decisions, until they weren't. A property acquisition, a staffing change. An investment adjustment, things I normally would have reviewed. Things I suddenly learned about after they happened. One afternoon, I walked into a conference room and found a meeting already underway. Daniel sat at the head of the table, Sophie beside him, 3 executives around them. The discussion stopped when I entered, not because I'd interrupted, because nobody expected me. The realization hit harder than I care to admit. I smiled anyway, asked a few questions, listened, contributed. Acted as though nothing felt wrong. Afterward, Daniel caught up with me in the hallway. "Mom," his smile appeared. The same smile I'd seen my entire life, yet somehow different now. We didn't know you were coming. I looked at him. You didn't invite me. His expression shifted immediately. Guilt, just for a second, then gone. We were trying to take some pressure off you. Pressure, interesting word. People often hide exclusion inside concern. I nodded, of course I nodded. Because mothers become experts at pretending things don't hurt. That night, Richard found me sitting alone in the library. Again. He seemed to be doing that a lot lately. Finding me in rooms where I sat quietly trying to make sense of things. He lowered himself into the chair across from mine. You look angry. I laughed. I'm not angry. He smiled knowingly. That's usually how I know you are. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question I hadn't wanted to ask. Do you think Daniel is pulling away? Richard didn't answer immediately. That frightened me more than any answer could have. Finally, he sighed. He thinks he's becoming independent. The words felt wrong. Because independence wasn't what I was seeing. Distance was, avoidance was, something else entirely was. I looked down at my hands. When did I become someone he needed independence from? Richard's eyes softened. The way they always did when he knew I was hurting. You didn't. Silence. Someone convinced him that's what this is. I didn't need him to say her name. We both knew. The harder truth came later. A few weeks afterward, Daniel and Sophie hosted a dinner party. Friends, business associates, neighbors, the house was full. Laughter echoed through every room. At one point, someone asked Daniel about a recent business success, a major deal. When I'd quietly helped structure months earlier, the guest smiled. You must have learned that from your mother. I remember waiting, not because I needed credit. Because I wanted to hear what my son would say. Daniel laughed. Then waved a hand dismissively. We're doing things differently now. The conversation moved on. Nobody noticed, except me and Richard. Across the room, our eyes met. For the first time in 46 years, I saw sadness replace concern in my husband's face. Not because of the company, not because of the money. Because he'd heard it too, the subtle rewriting of history, the beginning of a new story. A story where Daniel's success belonged only to Daniel. A story where the people who built the foundation slowly disappeared. That night after everyone left, I stood alone in the kitchen, loading dishes, cleaning up, trying not to think. Then I noticed something. A framed family photograph on the counter. Recent, beautiful, Daniel, Sophie, Lily, smiling, happy, perfect. I stared at it for several seconds before realizing what felt wrong. I wasn't in it, neither was Richard. Maybe it was innocent, probably it was. But standing there in the quiet house, holding that frame in my hands, I felt something I couldn't explain. Not jealousy, not anger, a warning. Like the distant rumble of thunder before a storm. The next morning, Richard called me into his office. His voice sounded serious, more serious than usual. When I entered, he closed the door behind me. Then pointed toward the chair across from his desk. Sit down, Ellie. My stomach tightened immediately. Because after 46 years of marriage, I knew that tone. Something had changed, something important. Richard folded his hands together, looked directly at me, and quietly said the words that would haunt me long after he was gone. I need to tell you what I think Sophie is really waiting for. Part 5, What My Husband SAW, Before I Did There Are Conversations That Change Your Life. And then there are conversations you don't understand until years later. The one Richard and I had that morning belonged to the second kind. I need to tell you what I think Sophie is really waiting for. The words lingered between us, heavy, uncomfortable. I sat across from my husband and immediately felt defensive, not because I disagreed. Because I already knew where this conversation was going. And I didn't want to go there. Richard leaned back in his chair. The sunlight coming through the office window made him look older than he had just a few months earlier. Cancer does that. It steals years before it steals life. I folded my arms. What are you saying? He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. The way people do when they know the truth might hurt someone they love. I don't think Sophie wants the company. I frowned. That wasn't what I expected. What? I don't think she wants the money either. Now I was confused. Because if not those things, then what? Richard sighed, then looked directly at me. I think she wants your place. The room went completely silent. I actually laughed, not because it was funny. Because it sounded ridiculous. My place, he nodded. Your influence, a pause. Your authority, another pause. Your position in this family. I shook my head immediately. No, the answer came too fast, too emotional, too certain. Which usually means it isn't completely honest. Richard didn't argue. That was one of the things I loved most about him. He never forced people to see what they weren't ready to see. Instead, he simply waited. And eventually they saw it themselves. You think she's trying to replace me? His expression softened. No, then he surprised me. I think she's trying to become irreplaceable. The distinction mattered. More than I realized at the time, because one comes from greed, the other comes from fear. Richard looked toward the family photographs lining the shelves. Pictures from decades of birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings, little league games, graduations, a lifetime. Then he pointed toward one photograph. A picture from Lily's 8th birthday. Everyone smiling, everyone together. Look at Sophie. I looked, nothing seemed unusual. Now look at everybody else. I frowned, still confused. Richard smiled sadly. Everyone is looking at Lily. A pause. Sophie is looking at you. I stared longer, and suddenly I saw it, not clearly, not completely, but enough. The photograph felt different now. As though it contained a secret I hadn't noticed before, I set it down. You're reading too much into things. Richard nodded slowly. I hope so. The answer unsettled me more than any argument could have, because it wasn't certainty, it was concern. And concern is harder to dismiss. Over the next several months, Richard's health declined. The treatments became harder, the recovery periods longer. Some days he looked almost normal, others, not at all. But even then he remained observant, watching, listening, paying attention. One evening, after a family dinner, Richard and I sat alone in the living room. The house was finally quiet. Daniel and Sophie had left. The dishes were done, the lights were dim. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Richard surprised me. Do you know what worries me most? I expected him to say cancer, or the company, or leaving me alone. Instead, he shook his head. It's Daniel. I looked at him. Daniel loves us. I know, the answer came immediately, without hesitation, without doubt. Richard smiled. So do I. Silence. Then, that's why I'm worried. I didn't understand, not yet. Richard rubbed his hands together slowly, thoughtfully. The people who don't care are predictable. A pause. The people who care can convince themselves they're doing the right thing. The room felt colder. I stared at him. What are you trying to say? Richard leaned forward, his eyes locked onto mine. And suddenly I saw something I hadn't seen before. Fear, real fear, not for himself, for us. For years, Daniel has wanted two things. I waited, to be a good son, a pause, and to be a good husband. I nodded, of course, that's normal. That's admirable. Richard looked away, toward the darkened window, toward his reflection. Toward the future, he wasn't sure he'd be here to see. The problem comes when those two goals stop pointing in the same direction. The words settled heavily into my chest. Because suddenly I understood, not completely, but enough to feel afraid, enough to wish I didn't. Several weeks later, Richard was admitted to the hospital. Nothing dramatic, just another complication, another setback. Another reminder that time was running out. One afternoon, while he slept, I stepped into the hallway to get coffee. As I rounded a corner, I heard voices, Daniel and Sophie. They were standing near a window overlooking the parking lot. Neither saw me. I should have walked away. Instead, I stopped. Not because I wanted to listen, because I heard my name. She still controls everything. Sophie's voice, calm, frustrated. Daniel answered, Not now. A pause, please. Sophie sighed. I'm just being realistic. Silence. Then the sentence that stayed with me. The sentence I would replay 1,000 times later. When your father is gone, things have to change. I waited for Daniel to object, to defend me, to defend us, to say something, anything. Instead, there was only silence, a long silence. The kind that answers questions words never do. I left before hearing more. Because somehow the silence hurt worse than the conversation. That evening I sat beside Richard's hospital bed. He looked exhausted, fragile, smaller somehow. Yet when he saw my face, he knew immediately. What happened? I told him, not everything, just enough. When I finished, he closed his eyes. For several seconds he said nothing, then he reached for my hand. His grip felt weaker than before, but still familiar, still Richard, still home. And quietly, almost sadly, he said, "Ellie." I squeezed his hand. "What?" His eyes opened. The sadness in them nearly broke me. Because it wasn't sadness for himself. It was sadness for something already slipping away. Something neither of us knew how to stop. Then he whispered the words that would haunt me long after he was gone. One day Daniel is going to choose what makes his life easier. A pause, long, painful, final. And I'm terrified that choice won't be you. The monitor beside his bed continued its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. But for the first time since his diagnosis, I wasn't afraid of losing my husband. I was afraid of losing my son. Part 6. The day they called me a burden. The strange thing about grief is that it doesn't arrive alone. It brings confusion, exhaustion, loneliness. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, it brings people who mistake your pain for weakness. 3 weeks after Richard's funeral, I woke up and forgot for a moment that he was gone. For 3 beautiful seconds, I reached across the bed expecting to find him there. For 3 beautiful seconds the world was still normal, then reality returned, cold, immediate, final. The empty side of the mattress, the untouched pillow, the silence, God, the silence. 46 years of marriage leaves behind a very loud absence. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time that morning. Listening to a house that no longer sounded like home. The funeral had been perfect, elegant, respectful, hundreds of people attended. Business leaders, old friends, employees, family. Everyone had stories about Richard. Everyone had something kind to say. Everyone except the one person who mattered most, me. Because grief steals language. And I still hadn't found mine. At first Daniel was attentive. He called regularly, visited often, checked on me, brought groceries, handled paperwork. The son I'd raised seemed to return. For a little while, I believed Richard had been wrong. For a little while, I believed fear had made us imagine problems that weren't really there. Then Sophie began helping more, and everything changed. It started with small things, always small things. That's how people take control, never all at once. One afternoon she arrived carrying containers of homemade soup. "Mom, you've lost weight." I laughed softly. "My husband died." Her smile tightened. Exactly. At the time it sounded compassionate. Looking back, I hear something different. Evaluation, measurement, the beginning of a narrative. A week later she commented on my driving, then my sleeping habits, then my memory, always gently, always kindly, always with concern. One evening we sat together in the living room. Lily was upstairs. Daniel was answering emails. The television played quietly in the background. Out of nowhere, Sophie asked, "Do you ever forget things?" I smiled. "Everyone forgets things." She nodded, thoughtful, interested. Almost too interested. "What kinds of things?" I laughed. "Where I put my glasses. Names? No. Appointments? Sometimes." Important appointments? The question felt oddly specific. I remember staring at her, not offended, just confused. "Why are you asking?" She smiled immediately, too quickly. "No reason, but there was a reason, I know that now." Because over the following months the questions continued, not just from Sophie, from Daniel too, the same questions, the same concerns. The same observations, repeated so often they began sounding rehearsed. One afternoon I forgot where I'd left my phone, a perfectly normal thing. 5 minutes later, Daniel was asking whether I'd considered seeing a specialist. Another time, I misplaced a utility bill. Sophie suggested a cognitive evaluation. Then came the doctor's appointment. The one I didn't know had been arranged until the day before. Daniel drove, Sophie came too. That should have been my first warning. Instead, I convinced myself they were worried. Because that's what mothers do. We translate betrayal into concern until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. The doctor was polite, professional, thorough. And at the end of the examination, he smiled. "Mrs. Whitmore, your cognitive function is excellent." I nearly laughed from relief. There it was. Proof, objective, undeniable. The matter was settled, or so I thought. In the parking lot afterward, Sophie folded her arms. He only saw her for an hour. Daniel didn't answer. Sophie continued. People can hide a lot in an hour. I stopped walking, slowly, deliberately, then turned toward her. For the first time in years, my patience cracked. "Sophie," she looked surprised. Maybe she'd forgotten I still had a voice. "I'm standing right here." Silence, an uncomfortable silence. Daniel shifted awkwardly. But neither apologized. That frightened me more than the conversation itself. Because apologies require self-awareness. And self-awareness was disappearing. By autumn, something else had changed, the company. I was no longer invited to certain meetings. Certain reports stopped arriving. Certain decisions appeared fully formed before I ever heard about them. Every time I questioned it, the answers sounded identical. "We don't want to stress you. We're trying to help. You should rest, rest." Such a harmless word, until people start using it to remove you from your own life. One evening, Daniel and Sophie invited me to dinner. Their tone felt serious, prepared. Like people rehearsing difficult conversations. The moment dessert arrived, I knew, mothers always know. Daniel cleared his throat. Sophie reached for his hand. And suddenly, I felt the same dread I had felt outside Richard's hospital room months earlier. "Mom?" His voice sounded nervous. I looked at him. Waiting, hoping, fear creeping slowly into my chest. Daniel glanced toward Sophie, then back at me. "We've been talking. A terrible beginning. The kind that never leads anywhere good." I set down my fork. "What about?" Neither answered immediately. That silence again. The silence that had started appearing everywhere. Finally Sophie spoke, carefully, softly. As though she were discussing someone fragile, someone absent. Someone who wasn't sitting 3 feet away. "We think you're carrying too much." I stared at her, then at Daniel, and suddenly I understood, not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to know this wasn't concern anymore. This was preparation. Preparation for something bigger, something final. Daniel took a deep breath. And said the words that made my stomach drop. "Mom. Maybe it's time we talked about letting us manage things for a while." The room went completely still. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, my husband's empty chair sat in the corner, watching, accusing, remembering. And for the first time since Richard died, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt alone. Because sitting across from me wasn't just my son. It was a man beginning to believe a story about me that wasn't true. And somewhere deep inside, I knew something far worse was coming. I just didn't know how soon. Part 7. My son chose the easiest lie. The most painful betrayals are never the loud ones. They don't arrive with screaming. They don't arrive with slammed doors. They don't arrive with dramatic confessions. The worst betrayals arrive disguised as concern, wrapped in soft voices. Delivered by people who insist they're helping you. And by the time you recognize them, everyone has already agreed on the story except you. 2 days after that dinner, Sophie arrived at my house carrying a leather folder. The same folder I'd seen her carrying more and more often lately. It seemed to follow her everywhere. Family meetings, doctor appointments, business discussions, always present, always waiting. I opened the front door. She smiled warmly. The same smile that had once made me believe she was the daughter I never had. "Mom." I stepped aside. "Come in." She entered confidently. Not like a guest, like someone already comfortable with ownership. That realization bothered me more than I wanted to admit. We sat in the kitchen. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the table. The room felt strangely familiar and strangely foreign. The house hadn't changed, I had. Or maybe the people around me had. Sophie placed the folder in front of her, carefully, deliberately. The way attorneys handle evidence. Immediately my stomach tightened. What is that? Her smile remained, gentle, measured, prepared, just some paperwork. I almost laughed. Nothing good has ever started with the words, just some paperwork. She opened the folder, several documents appeared, highlighted sections. Sticky notes, tabs, preparation, a lot of preparation. Then she slid one document toward me. Daniel and I think this might make things easier. I looked down. My eyes immediately found my name, then another name, Daniel's. Then a phrase that made my chest tighten, power of attorney. For a moment I simply stared, certain I'd misunderstood. Certain there had to be another explanation. I looked up. What is this? Sophie folded her hands together. The performance of concern was flawless. We worry about you. There it was again, worry, concern, protection. The language people use when they want control without admitting it. I pushed the document back across the table. I don't need this. Her smile flickered, only briefly, but I saw it, the first crack. The first sign that this conversation wasn't going according to plan. We're just trying to help. No, my voice remained calm, steady, clear. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. Silence, then Sophie sighed, a disappointed sigh. The kind parents use when children refuse to eat vegetables. And suddenly, I understood something. She wasn't talking to me like family anymore. She was talking to me like a problem. A problem requiring management. That realization sat heavily in my chest. I stood, the conversation was over, at least for me, but Sophie remained seated. Then she said something that stopped me. Daniel agrees. The room became very quiet. Not because the words surprised me. Because I already suspected they were true. Hearing them out loud made them real. I looked toward the window, toward the backyard. Toward the oak tree Richard planted 30 years earlier. Anything to avoid the hurt rushing toward me. When did he decide that? Sophie hesitated just long enough. Then, we've been discussing it for months. Months, not days, not weeks, months. The betrayal wasn't beginning, it had already happened. I simply hadn't been invited to witness it. That evening I called Daniel. He arrived after sunset. Alone, for that I was grateful. At least this conversation belonged to us, for now. He entered through the kitchen door. The same door he'd run through as a child. The same door he'd carried Lily through when she was born. The same door that suddenly felt like an entrance for a stranger. I poured coffee, out of habit. Neither of us drank it. Finally I sat down. The paperwork lay between us, like evidence, like a warning. Like a test neither of us wanted to take. I looked directly at him. When were you planning to tell me? Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. A gesture he'd had since childhood, whenever he felt guilty, whenever he felt trapped. Whenever he knew he was wrong. Mom, I waited, the explanation never came. Instead, he repeated the same phrases. The same carefully constructed language, the same script. We're worried about you. My heart sank, not because of the words. Because they no longer sounded like Daniel's words. They sounded borrowed, rehearsed, practiced. I leaned back in my chair. Do you believe I'm incapable of managing my own life? Silence. The longest silence of my life. I watched him search for an answer, an honest answer. A safe answer, a convenient answer. Finally he spoke. And somehow the truth was worse than any lie. I think you've been under a lot of stress. Not yes, not no, avoidance, the language of cowards. The language of people trying to protect themselves. I stared at him, this boy, this man. This son I'd spent 44 years loving. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Do you trust me? His eyes immediately dropped, not to the paperwork, not to the table, to the floor, and in that moment I knew before he spoke. Before the answer arrived, I already knew. Because people only avoid eye contact when the truth hurts. The silence stretched between us, seconds, maybe longer. Then Daniel finally looked up, but not at me, past me, somewhere beyond me, somewhere safer. And quietly he said, "I trust you, Mom." A pause, tiny, almost invisible, yet large enough to destroy something. Then came the second sentence. The sentence that changed everything. The sentence I would hear again and again in my nightmares. The sentence that proved Richard had been right. Maybe you just forgot. The room went completely still. I stared at my son. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was sitting across from someone who needed me to be weak, because if I wasn't weak, then he would have to admit what he was doing. And neither of us were ready for that truth, yet. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, Richard's empty chair sat in the corner, silent, watching. And somewhere deep inside me, a terrible realization finally took shape. This wasn't about paperwork anymore. This wasn't about memory. This wasn't even about money. This was about whether my son was willing to sacrifice the truth to make his own life easier. And I was terrified. I already knew the answer. Part 8. The nursing home people think heartbreak is loud. It isn't. Heartbreak is surprisingly quiet. It's the sound of a pen moving across paper, a suitcase zipper closing, a car door shutting. The moment someone you love stops fighting for you. 3 weeks after Daniel told me I might have forgotten, he called and asked if we could have breakfast together. Just the two of us. The request should have made me happy. Instead, it made me nervous. Because by then, I'd learned something important. Whenever people begin a sentence with, "We just want what's best for you," something bad usually follows. Still, I agreed because he was my son. And mothers spend a lifetime hoping the next conversation will bring their child back. The morning felt strangely familiar. Texas sunshine, blue sky. The smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. For a few minutes I almost convinced myself everything would be okay. Then I walked outside and saw the SUV. The same black SUV from part 1. The same vehicle that now feels permanently attached to one of the worst memories of my life. Daniel stepped out, smiled, not quite convincingly. But he tried. I appreciated that. Which is a sad thing to admit. How grateful we become for small kindnesses from people who are hurting us. "Ready, Mom?" I studied his face. He looked tired, older. Not guilty enough, but tired. "Where are we going?" "Breakfast first." Not a lie, just not the whole truth. Those are often the most dangerous kind. The drive lasted almost 40 minutes. At first we talked about ordinary things. The weather, Lily's school, football, traffic. The kind of conversations people use when they're standing near something they don't want to acknowledge. Then gradually the conversation died. Neither of us revived it. By the time we pulled into the parking lot, I already knew, not where we were. But that something had been decided without me. Again, the building stood ahead. Elegant, clean, expensive, landscaped gardens, a stone fountain. Large windows, the sort of place designed to make difficult decisions feel respectable. My eyes found the sign, Willow Grove Senior Living. For a moment, everything inside me stopped, not dramatically, not emotionally, just stopped. Like a clock whose batteries suddenly died, Daniel turned off the engine. Neither of us moved. The silence inside the vehicle felt unbearable. Then I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A suitcase, my suitcase. The navy blue one from my closet, packed, prepared, waiting. My pulse quickened. Slowly I turned toward my son, Daniel. He stared at the steering wheel. Exactly the way he had stared at the floor weeks earlier. The same avoidance, the same fear. "What is this?" Nothing, no answer. Outside, another vehicle pulled into the lot. Sophie stepped out, holding a folder. Of course she was holding a folder. Somehow she always had one. She walked toward us with calm confidence. Like someone arriving at a meeting, not a betrayal. And that hurt more than anything. Because it meant this wasn't emotional for her anymore, it was administrative. The passenger door opened. Sophie leaned down slightly. "Hi, Mom." I looked at her, then at Daniel, then back at her. Neither of them looked surprised. Neither of them looked uncertain. This had been planned, discussed, scheduled, agreed upon. I was simply the last person informed. What is my suitcase doing here? Sophie answered first, not Daniel, never Daniel. We think this is the safest option. Safe, another one of those words, like concern, like support, like help. Words people hide behind when they don't want to say what they're really doing. I turned toward my son, not Sophie, never Sophie. Because this wasn't her moment, this was his. Do you want me here? His jaw tightened, the question hung between us, simple, direct. Impossible to escape, and for one brief second I saw the little boy he'd once been. The boy who cried when he thought he'd disappointed me. The boy who used to run into my arms after baseball practice. The boy who once promised he'd always take care of me, then the moment disappeared. And the man sitting beside me chose comfort over courage. I think it's best for everyone. Everyone, there it was again, that word, that terrible word, everyone. I looked out the windshield. At the building, at the people walking through the front doors, at the life waiting inside. Then I nodded, not because I agreed. Because suddenly I understood. I wasn't included in everyone, not anymore. Inside, the lobby smelled like fresh flowers and polished wood. A receptionist greeted us warmly, professional, friendly, efficient. The kind of person who probably witnessed scenes like this every day. She typed something into her computer, then smiled. Mrs. Whitmore, I nodded. Welcome, welcome. What a strange word when you've arrived somewhere against your will. She continued typing, then paused. Everything has already been completed. My stomach tightened. I looked toward Daniel, then Sophie, neither spoke. The receptionist clicked her mouse once more, then looked up. Your son signed all the admission paperwork last week. Last week, not yesterday, not this morning, last week. The decision had already been made. The conversation, the concern, the discussions, the paperwork. None of it had been about asking me. It had been about preparing me. The realization landed like a physical blow. Not because I was entering a nursing home. Because I finally understood something Richard had tried to tell me before he died. This was never really about Sophie. Sophie had a plan. But Daniel had given it permission. And somehow that hurt infinitely more. The receptionist handed me a folder. Inside was a room number, a meal schedule, activity information, a new life, one I hadn't chosen. I stared at the paperwork, then at my son, waiting, hoping, praying. For one final sign that he would stop this, that he would stand up. That he would remember who he was. Instead, Daniel looked away, and that was when I knew. The nursing home wasn't the worst thing that had happened to me. Losing my husband wasn't either. The worst thing was realizing my son had spent months helping remove me from the life I built. And somehow convinced himself it was an act of love. As a staff member reached for my suitcase, my phone suddenly vibrated inside my purse. One new message. One unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost, then I opened it. The message contained only one sentence. A sentence that instantly made my heart stop. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Robert Gaines, your husband's attorney. There is something Richard never told Daniel and Sophie. Part 9, the last protection. The text message stayed on my screen long after Daniel and Sophie left. 3 lines, 20 words. And somehow they carried more weight than everything that had happened that morning. There is something Richard never told Daniel and Sophie. I sat alone in my new room, if you could call it that. The room was beautiful. Comfortable bed, large window, fresh flowers, soft lighting. Everything designed to make people feel cared for. Everything except the one thing I actually needed, home. Outside, elderly residents walked through a garden path. Some pushed walkers, some sat on benches. Some stared into the distance, waiting, remembering, existing. And for the first time in my life, I felt terrified of becoming one of them, not because they were old. Because they looked forgotten. I looked down at the message again, then pressed call. The phone rang twice. Mrs. Whitmore, Robert Gaines. My husband's attorney for nearly 30 years. The same man who had handled our trusts, our investments, our estate planning. The same man Richard trusted more than almost anyone, Robert. My voice sounded weaker than I intended. He immediately noticed. "You've been admitted." I closed my eyes. The fact that he already knew told me everything. Yes, silence, not surprised silence, disappointed silence. Then, "I'm sorry." Something about those words nearly broke me. Because unlike everyone else lately, he wasn't apologizing for a situation. He was apologizing for a betrayal. The difference mattered. Richard expected this, didn't he? The question escaped before I could stop it. The line went quiet, long enough to answer me. Finally, Robert spoke, carefully. "Your husband hoped he was wrong." A pause, but yes. My chest tightened. I stared toward the window, toward the garden, toward strangers living lives I didn't know, and suddenly I felt angry. Not at Sophie, not even at Daniel, at Richard, for seeing this coming. For not stopping it, for leaving me behind to face it alone. As if reading my thoughts, Robert continued. "He couldn't stop people from making choices, Elinor." His voice softened. "But he could prepare for those choices." The words settled heavily inside me. Prepare. That sounded exactly like Richard. Always planning, always thinking ahead, always protecting people. Even when they didn't know they needed protection. What did he do? Another pause. "Then, I think we should meet in person." The old lawyer in him. Never revealing important things over the phone. Never rushing, never careless. I almost laughed. Richard would have approved. The next afternoon, Robert arrived at Willow Grove. For the first time since entering that building, I felt something close to relief. Not because I trusted lawyers, because I trusted Richard, and Richard trusted Robert. That was enough. We sat in a private conference room. A stack of folders rested on the table. Thick folders, old folders. The kind that contain years of decisions, years of secrets, years of preparation. Robert adjusted his glasses, then looked directly at me. "Elinor." His tone changed, professional, serious. "This conversation is protected by attorney-client privilege." My pulse quickened. What did Richard do? Robert opened the first folder. Inside were documents I immediately recognized. Trust agreements, corporate structures, ownership records. Things I'd signed over decades, yet something felt different, something important. Then Robert asked a question, a strange question. "Who do you think owned most of the family's assets?" I frowned. "What kind of question is that?" He waited patiently, so I answered. "Richard." The lawyer nodded slowly. Exactly as though he'd expected that answer. Then he turned a document toward me. And for a moment I genuinely thought I was reading it wrong. I picked it up, read it again, then a third time, still the same, still impossible. Still true, my name everywhere, not Richard's. Mine. I looked up, confused. "Robert," my voice barely worked. "What is this?" For the first time all afternoon, the attorney smiled. Not happily, sadly, almost fondly. The smile of a man remembering an old friend. 25 years ago, Richard made a decision. A pause. He decided that the family would always be safest if the final authority remained with you. I stared at him, unable to process the words. Robert opened another folder, then another, then another. Each one telling the same story. Properties, investments, voting shares, trust structures, control mechanisms. Layers upon layers of protection. And at the center of all of them, me. The room felt suddenly smaller. My entire marriage flashed through my mind, every major decision, every conversation, every document, every signature. How had I never seen it? Then I realized something. Richard never hid it from me. I simply never asked because I trusted him completely. Robert slid one final document across the table. Unlike the others, this one was sealed, a single envelope. My husband's handwriting across the front, for Elinor, only if necessary. My heart nearly stopped. Because I recognized the handwriting instantly, even after all these years, even after all this pain. I reached for the envelope slowly, almost afraid to touch it. "What's inside?" Robert leaned back, his expression changed again, more serious now. More cautious. "That," he said quietly, "is the document Daniel and Sophie never knew existed." Silence. Then, and it's the reason they may have just lost everything. I stared at the envelope, at my husband's handwriting. At the final protection he had left behind. And for the first time since arriving at Willow Grove, I wasn't thinking about what Daniel and Sophie had taken from me. I was wondering what Richard had seen coming all those years ago. Because whatever was inside that envelope, he had created it long before anyone ever mentioned a nursing home, long before the paperwork, long before the lies, long before the betrayal. As if he'd known this day would eventually arrive, and somehow. That thought frightened me more than anything else. Part 10. They lost everything in one morning. People imagine revenge feels satisfying. It doesn't. At least not the kind they show in movies. Real justice is quieter, sadder. Because by the time the truth finally arrives, you've already lost the people you wanted to keep. 3 days after Robert showed me the envelope, he scheduled a family meeting. Mandatory attendance. Those were his exact words. Mandatory. Not requested, not suggested, mandatory. The meeting took place in the conference room at Whitmore Development. The same building Richard had spent most of his adult life building. The same building Daniel believed he would one day control. The same building Sophie already acted like she owned. When Robert escorted me inside, both of them were already waiting. Daniel stood near the window, anxious, restless. Sophie sat at the conference table, perfect posture, perfect makeup, perfect confidence, at least for now. The moment they saw me, surprise flashed across both faces, not because I was there. Because I wasn't supposed to be there. Not yet, not after the nursing home, not after the paperwork. Not after the decisions they'd already made. Sophie recovered first. Of course she did, she always recovered first. Mom, her voice sounded warm. Concerned, practiced, the same voice she'd used while helping move me into Willow Grove. I nodded politely, nothing more. Across the room Daniel avoided my eyes. That hurt, even now, even after everything. Some wounds don't stop hurting just because you understand them. Robert entered a moment later carrying 3 folders, one for each of us. He sat at the head of the table, opened his folder, removed a document. Then looked directly at Daniel. Your father instructed me to hold this meeting if certain conditions were ever met. The room immediately changed. I felt it, so did Daniel, so did Sophie. Because Richard had always been the one person nobody could manipulate. Even after death, his presence still carried weight. Robert continued. One of those conditions involved Evelyn being placed into long-term residential care against her wishes. The color immediately drained from Daniel's face, just slightly, but enough. Sophie remained motionless. I almost admired her composure, almost. Then Robert opened the sealed envelope. The envelope Richard had prepared years earlier. The envelope that had waited patiently for this exact moment. My husband's handwriting seemed to fill the room. Even before a single word was read, Robert unfolded the document, then began, to my son. Silence, the room felt smaller. He continued reading. If you are hearing this, then something has happened that I prayed never would. Daniel swallowed hard. I watched his hands. The same hands I held when he learned to walk, now trembling. Your mother has spent her life protecting this family. A pause. Long before there was a company, another. Long before there was wealth, another. Long before there was anything worth inheriting. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then Robert reached the next paragraph, and everything changed. For 25 years, I have structured our family holdings under a protective trust. Daniel frowned, Sophie straightened. For the first time, uncertainty appeared, small but real. Robert looked up. Then delivered the sentence that shattered the room. Evelyn Whitmore is the sole controlling beneficiary. Silence, absolute silence. Daniel blinked once, twice. Like someone trying to wake up, Sophie leaned forward. What does that mean? The lawyer turned a page. It means the trust, the voting shares, the investment portfolio, the ranch property, and the primary residence all remain under Evelyn's authority. I watched Sophie's expression change, not dramatically, gradually. Confidence becoming confusion, confusion becoming concern, concern becoming fear, Daniel finally spoke. What are you saying? Robert didn't hesitate. I'm saying your mother owns everything. The room froze, nobody breathed, nobody moved. For a moment, even the air seemed to stop. Daniel laughed softly, a nervous laugh. The kind people use when reality becomes too uncomfortable. No, he shook his head, that's not possible. Robert slid several documents across the table. Ownership records, trust structures, corporate filings, signed, verified, legal, final. Daniel grabbed the papers, read them, then read them again. The color drained from his face completely. Because every page told the same story. Not Richard, not Daniel, not the company, Elinor, me, always me. Sophie finally found her voice. What about Daniel's inheritance? The question escaped too quickly, too urgently. And for the first time, nobody in the room missed what truly mattered to her. Robert adjusted his glasses, then opened another document. The final one, the most important one. The one Richard had hidden for decades. I'm glad you asked. The words landed like thunder. Robert looked directly at Daniel, then read aloud. If my son ever participates in removing Elena Whitmore from her home, her business affairs, or her personal freedom through coercion, manipulation, or false claims of incapacity, the lawyer paused. The silence became unbearable, then he finished. His inheritance shall be immediately and permanently revoked. The room exploded. What? Daniel shot to his feet. The chair nearly tipped over. That's insane, his voice echoed through the conference room. Years of entitlement breaking apart all at once. Robert remained calm. No, a pause. Your father called it protection. Daniel stared at him, speechless. Meanwhile, Sophie looked as though someone had drained every drop of blood from her body. Because she understood before Daniel did. The trust wasn't punishing them. The trust had anticipated them. Years ago, before the arguments, before the nursing home, before Richard became sick. He had already seen the possibility, already prepared for it, already chosen his side. Mine. Daniel slowly sat back down, his hands shaking. His eyes unfocused, lost. Then he asked the question that finally revealed what he had been thinking all along. The question Richard had spent years hoping he'd never ask. What do we own? The room went silent. Robert folded his hands, looked directly at him, and answered with devastating simplicity. Your salaries, nothing else, just those two words, your salaries. And in that moment, Daniel and Sophie realized something that terrified them more than losing money. They realized they had spent years trying to remove the one person who held everything together. And now, they had nothing left to stand on. As silence swallowed the room, I looked at my son, not with anger, not with victory, only sadness. Because the thing he had truly lost wasn't sitting in a trust. It was sitting across from him. And he still didn't understand that yet. Part 11, the thing my son really lost. Money reveals people, but loss exposes them. The moment Robert finished speaking, the room fell silent. Not the kind of silence that follows a surprise. The kind that follows an ending. Something had ended in that conference room, not the inheritance, not the trust, not the business, something much older, much more fragile. The illusion that our family was still intact. Daniel remained seated, motionless. His eyes fixed on the documents spread across the table, page after page, signature after signature, proof after proof. The truth was no longer negotiable, no longer debatable, no longer avoidable. Across from him, Sophie stared into nothing. For the first time in 18 years, she had no strategy, no argument. No carefully prepared explanation, only consequences. And consequences are difficult to charm. Robert quietly closed his folder. The sound seemed unusually loud, final, then he stood. I'll give you some privacy. Nobody stopped him, the door closed behind him. And suddenly it was just the three of us, a mother, a son. And the woman standing between them, or perhaps beside them. I wasn't entirely sure anymore. Several long seconds passed. Then Daniel finally looked at me, really looked at me. Maybe for the first time in months. Maybe for the first time in years, his eyes were red, confused, lost. He looked less like a 44-year-old executive and more like the frightened little boy who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares. Mom. The word broke halfway out. I waited. He swallowed hard. Then whispered, I didn't know. There it was, the first defense, not anger, not denial, ignorance. I studied his face, the trembling hands. The shaking voice, the panic, and strangely enough I believed him. I believed he didn't know about the trust. I believed he didn't know about the clause. I believed he didn't know Richard had prepared for this possibility. But that wasn't the question that mattered, so I asked the one that did. Didn't know what? Daniel blinked. The question caught him off guard. What? I leaned forward slightly. Didn't know what? Silence. Then, that everything belonged to you. I nodded slowly. Exactly, that was his answer. Not, I didn't know how much I hurt you. Not, I didn't know you felt alone. Not, I didn't know what we were doing to you, no. The thing that shocked him was ownership. The thing that devastated him was the trust, the money, the control, the inheritance, and suddenly I felt tired, so very tired. Because for a brief moment after Richard's letter, I had hoped. Hoped this was about manipulation. Hoped Daniel had simply been weak, hoped he had lost his way. But sitting there, listening to his first reaction, I realized something painful. Part of him had wanted what Sophie wanted, maybe not all of it, maybe not consciously, but enough. Enough to stay silent, enough to look away. Enough to let it happen. Sophie finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Elinor, I looked at her. For the first time in years there was no confidence left, no performance, no mask. Only a woman standing in the wreckage of her own choices. We never meant for this to happen. The sentence hung in the air, ridiculous, heartbreaking, human. I almost laughed, not because it was funny. Because people rarely mean the destination. They only mean the first step, and then the next, and the next. Until one day they wake up somewhere they never planned to go. You never meant what? I asked quietly. Neither answered. Because there was no answer, not an honest one. Daniel stood, walked toward the window, looked out over the city, the company, the skyline. The future he thought belonged to him. Then he spoke, still facing away. We were trying to protect the business. I closed my eyes. There it was, the lie he'd told himself. The lie that made everything possible. Protection, concern, responsibility, different words, same excuse. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself staring at the empty chair beside him. And suddenly I imagined Richard there, watching, listening, knowing. I almost smiled. Because my husband would have hated this conversation, not because it was painful, because it was overdue. I stood slowly, my knees ached. My back ached, my heart ached. Age does that, so does betrayal. Then I walked toward my son, not quickly, not dramatically. Just a mother crossing a room. When I stopped in front of him, Daniel finally met my eyes, and I saw it, for the first time, real fear, not fear of losing money. Not fear of losing the company, fear of losing me. Finally, too late, but finally, his voice cracked. I'm sorry. Tears filled his eyes, then mine. Not because the apology fixed anything. Because I had waited so long to hear it. I looked at him for a very long time. Long enough for silence to become uncomfortable. Long enough for both of us to understand what came next mattered. Then I spoke, quietly, gently. And somehow that made it hurt more. You didn't lose your inheritance today. Daniel frowned, confused, broken. What? I swallowed hard because this was the truth, the real truth. The one hiding beneath all the documents, all the money, all the betrayal. No, Daniel. A tear slid down my cheek. You lost it the day you decided it was easier to believe I was weak. My voice faltered, only briefly, then I continued. Then admit your wife was wrong. The room went completely still. Daniel's face collapsed, not physically, emotionally. The way buildings collapse from damage nobody can see, because deep down he knew, he had always known. That Sophie hadn't forced him, not completely. She had offered a path, and he had chosen it. I stepped back, wiped my eyes. Then looked at both of them, at the family I had spent decades loving. At the people who had almost convinced themselves they were justified. And for the first time since Richard died, I felt something unexpected. Peace, not forgiveness, not yet peace. Because the truth was finally standing in the room with us. And nobody could ask it to leave. Then Daniel whispered the words that made my heart stop. Mom, a pause, small, terrified, childlike. Then, is there any way to fix this? And for the first time all day, I genuinely didn't know the answer. Part 12, what is worth saving? The hardest question isn't whether someone deserves forgiveness. The hardest question is whether you still recognize the person standing in front of you. Daniel's question lingered in the room long after he asked it. Is there any way to fix this? I looked at my son, really looked at him, not the executive, not the future heir, not the husband. Just the little boy I once held against my shoulder when thunderstorms frightened him. The little boy who used to run into my bedroom at 6 in the morning because he couldn't wait to show me a drawing. The little boy who once cried because he accidentally stepped on a bird's nest. For a moment, I could still see him. And somehow that hurt even more. Because I knew he was still in there somewhere, buried beneath fear, pride, weakness, bad choices, but still there. The problem wasn't that Daniel had become evil. The problem was that he'd become comfortable. Comfortable letting someone else make difficult decisions, comfortable looking away. Comfortable choosing peace over truth. And comfort can destroy a person just as effectively as cruelty. I took a slow breath, then answered honestly, I don't know. The words hit him harder than anger ever could, because anger leaves hope, uncertainty doesn't. Daniel lowered his head. Sophie stood motionless beside him. For once, she wasn't trying to rescue the conversation, wasn't trying to explain, wasn't trying to justify. Maybe she finally understood that some damage can't be negotiated. The meeting ended quietly. No shouting, no dramatic exits, no threats. Just silence, the kind of silence people carry home with them. The kind that follows them into empty rooms. The kind that waits beside their bed at night. I left first, not because I was victorious, because I was tired. For months, I'd been defending my own reality, my memory, my independence, my dignity. And suddenly, I didn't have to anymore. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the parking lot. For the first time in what felt like years, I stood completely alone. No Richard, no Daniel, no Sophie, just me. And strangely enough, I felt lighter, not happy, just lighter. A few days later, I left Willow Grove. The admission paperwork was revoked. The trust attorneys handled everything. Legally, it was simple. Emotionally, it wasn't. When I returned to the family estate, I walked through every room by myself. The kitchen, the library, the back porch, Richard's office. Every corner held a memory, every memory held a ghost. I sat at Richard's desk as the evening sunlight stretched across the room. His chair still creaked the same way. His books still lined the shelves. His reading glasses still sat exactly where he'd left them. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine he was still there, watching, listening. Waiting for me to tell him everything, then I laughed softly. Because the truth was, he already knew. Somehow, Richard had understood this family better than any of us. Weeks passed, then months. The company stabilized, the trust remained unchanged. Daniel lost his executive authority, not permanently, but long enough to learn what accountability felt like. Long enough to understand that leadership isn't something you inherit, it's something you earn. As for Sophie, life became very different. The social invitations slowed, the influence disappeared. People who once rushed to impress her suddenly became distant, not because of the money. Because reputations travel faster than explanations. I never sought revenge, I never had to. Reality handled that part on its own. One October afternoon, nearly 6 months later, someone knocked on my front door. I already knew who it was, mothers usually do. Daniel stood on the porch. Alone, no Sophie, no lawyers, no paperwork, just Daniel. For a moment neither of us spoke. He looked older, not physically, spiritually. Like life had finally forced him to meet himself. I brought something. He held up a cardboard box. I stepped aside. He entered. We carried the box into the kitchen. The same kitchen where he'd once eaten cereal before school. The same kitchen where Sophie had first learned our family recipes. The same kitchen where so many things had begun. Daniel placed the box on the table, then opened it. Photographs, hundreds of them, old photographs, family photographs, some were decades old. Others only a few years. I picked one up. Daniel at age 8, missing front teeth, baseball uniform, huge smile. I laughed against my will. Daniel smiled too, then his eyes filled with tears. I found them in the attic. I nodded. Neither of us needed to say more. The photographs weren't really the point. The memories were, the history, the people we'd once been. For a long time we looked through them together, quietly, occasionally laughing, occasionally crying. Eventually Daniel spoke. His voice barely above a whisper. I spent months thinking about the money. I didn't interrupt. I thought losing the inheritance was the worst thing that happened. A pause, then he shook his head. No, his eyes met mine. And for the first time in a very long time, there were no excuses left. No defenses, no lies, only truth. The worst thing was realizing how easily I stopped listening to you. My throat tightened because finally, he understood. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to begin. Tears rolled down his face. I kept telling myself I was protecting everyone. I nodded slowly. I know, his voice broke, but the truth is, silence. Then I was protecting myself. There it was. The confession Richard had waited years to hear. The truth buried beneath every bad decision. Fear, not greed, not hatred, fear of conflict. Fear of disappointing his wife, fear of choosing a side, fear of being the bad guy. And fear, left unchecked, becomes betrayal. I reached across the table, placed my hand over his. The same hand I'd held crossing streets. The same hand I'd held in hospital waiting rooms. The same hand I'd once taught to tie a shoe. Daniel looked down at it, then began crying openly, like a child, like a son. Like someone finally exhausted from pretending, I squeezed his hand gently. Not because everything was fixed, because it wasn't. Some wounds heal, others become scars, and scars remain. That doesn't mean life ends. It just means life remembers. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the kitchen window, Daniel finally asked the question he'd been carrying for months. Can you forgive me? I looked at him, at the tears, the regret, the honesty, the pain. Then I thought about Richard, about everything he'd built. Everything he'd protected, everything he'd tried to teach us. And suddenly, I realized something. The greatest thing my husband left behind wasn't the trust. It wasn't the company. It wasn't the money. It was a choice. The choice between bitterness and healing. The choice between winning and rebuilding. The choice between being right and being whole. I smiled sadly, then answered. I can forgive you. Daniel closed his eyes. A sob escaped his chest. But before relief could settle across his face, I continued. A mother's final lesson, the lesson he needed most. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. His eyes opened again. I squeezed his hand. It means I refuse to spend the rest of my life carrying it. Silence, warm, peaceful, honest. The kind of silence our family hadn't known in years. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the yard. Inside, the photographs remained scattered across the table. An entire lifetime, messy, complicated, beautiful. And finally, I understood what Richard had been protecting all along. Not the fortune, not the inheritance, not the company, the truth. That money can build a legacy. But love is the only thing that makes it worth leaving behind. And as I sat there beside my son, surrounded by the memories of a life we had nearly destroyed, I realized something else. The fortune had never been the inheritance. The inheritance was the mother who loved him before he had anything to inherit. And that was the one thing he almost lost forever.